She was 45, my neighbor, graceful, confident, and always a little distant. But that night, when she looked at me and said, "Stay tonight," I realized she wasn't asking for company. She was asking for something much deeper. It was close to midnight when I stepped out of my apartment. The hallway unusually quiet, carrying with it that hushed stillness only late hours seem to know. I had been planning to grab something from my car when I noticed the soft glow spilling out from my neighbor's open door across the hall. She stood there, framed in warm light, her hair pulled back loosely, strands falling against her face in a way that made her look both elegant and disarmingly natural. She was 45, and I'd always admired the quiet poise she carried in every small gesture, whether it was watering her plants on the balcony or offering me a smile when we crossed paths in the stairwell. Tonight, though, her smile was different, softer, almost uncertain. "Stay tonight," she said, her voice low, carrying that mix of confidence and something quieter beneath it, something I couldn't ignore. For a moment, I froze. The words weren't loud, but they seemed to echo in the stillness between us. I searched her eyes, tried to understand if she meant it as casually as it sounded, or if there was more hidden in her tone. The apartment behind her looked warm and inviting compared to the chill in the hallway. A single lamp was on, casting a golden hue over the room. I caught the faint scent of chamomile tea drifting out, blending with something floral. Her perfume, maybe subtle yet lingering. It felt like stepping into another world, one softer and slower than the pace of my own. "Are you sure?" I asked gently, almost to give her the chance to pull back if she didn't mean it. She nodded once, her lips parting in a quiet breath, as though she had rehearsed the moment, but still felt the weight of saying it out loud. "Just stay. It's too quiet tonight." There was vulnerability in those words that surprised me. She wasn't someone who revealed much, at least not in the handful of conversations we'd shared. And yet here she was, opening her door not just literally, but in a way that felt far more personal. I stepped inside, and she closed the door softly behind me. The air in her apartment was warmer, laced with the faint crackle of a candle burning on the side table. A knitted throw was draped over the couch, a book left open on the armrest, as though she had been trying to read, but couldn't quite lose herself in the pages. She wrapped her cardigan a little tighter around her frame, and for the first time I noticed not just her grace, but the hint of loneliness in the way her shoulders dipped. It stirred something protective in me, something that made me want to sit, to listen, to simply be here. Her eyes met mine again, and though she didn't say another word, I understood enough. She hadn't invited me in for noise or distraction. She had invited me to share the silence. And suddenly, that silence didn't feel heavy anymore. We settled at her kitchen table, the kind of table that looked like it had held 1,000 quiet meals and maybe just as many untold stories. The lamp above us cast a circle of warm light, softening the lines of the room, making the shadows seem gentle instead of harsh. She poured chamomile tea into 2 mismatched mugs, hers pale blue and mine with a faint chip along the rim. Even the imperfection felt strangely comforting, like this moment wasn't meant to be polished, just real. She sat across from me, her cardigan wrapped snugly, both hands cradling her cup as though the warmth steadied her. I watched the way her fingers curved around the porcelain, graceful and careful. She always carried herself with such composure, yet there was a quiet tremor beneath it tonight, a subtle hesitance that only showed if you were really paying attention. We started with small talk. She asked about my work, my day, and I answered, but I kept noticing the way her eyes lingered on me just a little too long, as if she wasn't listening for facts but for something deeper. When she laughed at a story I shared about a friend's clumsy mistake, the sound was low and soft, but it filled the space more fully than words ever could. The pauses between our conversations stretched, but they didn't feel awkward. They were the kind of silences that hummed with possibility, charged with everything neither of us dared to say. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on our wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even the soft rise and fall of her breath. The world had slowed, and I found myself wishing it would stay that way. Her gaze drifted downward for a moment, tracing the steam rising from her tea. "I don't usually have company this late," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "It feels different." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words without needing her to explain them further. "Different can be good," I said, my voice softer than I intended. When her eyes lifted to mine again, something flickered there, something almost vulnerable, though wrapped in that same elegance she always carried. It made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite name. I became acutely aware of the distance across the table, though it wasn't much. Her sleeve brushed against the wood as she shifted slightly, leaning in just enough that I could catch the faint scent of her perfume again, delicate and calming, like jasmine blended with warmth. For a moment, I imagined reaching across, letting my hand cover hers where it rested lightly on the table. The thought alone sent a ripple through me, equal parts longing and restraint. I didn't move, though. Instead, I held her gaze, letting the silence speak for us. And in that silence, I realized something. She didn't need me to fill the quiet with words. She needed me simply to share it with her, to make it less heavy. And sitting there, watching her lips curve into the faintest, almost hesitant smile, I knew that was exactly what I wanted to give. The tea between us had gone lukewarm, but neither of us moved to refill it. Instead, we just sat there, caught in the kind of silence that didn't demand to be broken but seemed to stretch until it finally carried its own weight. I leaned back slightly in my chair, studying her. There was something different in the way she held herself now, less guarded, though not careless. Almost as if she had reached a point where holding everything inside had become too tiring. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup slowly, a nervous rhythm she probably didn't even realize she was making. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled. "I don't always like the nights," she said softly. Her voice wasn't shaky, but it was quieter, like she was admitting something she hadn't planned to. I tilted my head slightly, waiting without pressing her. "They feel long," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the swirling tea. "Not because I'm afraid, but because the quiet is sometimes louder than anything else." You know, I didn't know, more than I expected. And the way she phrased it, the honesty tucked inside her words, hit me with a strange mix of tenderness and ache. "Understand," I said simply. My voice felt heavier than usual because I meant it. Silence has a way of reminding us of things we thought we'd forgotten. She finally lifted her gaze to me, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamp above. There was no mask this time, no polished poise, just her stripped down to something honest. And it made her even more beautiful. For a moment, I thought that might be all she'd say. But then her lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "That's why I asked you to stay tonight. Not because I needed help, not because I wanted noise, but because I didn't want the silence." The words carried weight. They weren't casual, and they weren't something she could take back easily. My chest tightened, not with discomfort, but with the strange responsibility of being trusted with something so personal. I reached for my mug, more as a way to steady myself than anything else. But when I set it back down, I noticed her hand resting close to mine on the table. Almost without thinking, my fingers brushed against hers. Her hand stilled. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let it linger, the lightest contact, yet it sent a current through me that I felt everywhere. Her skin was warm, delicate, and the touch, so small, carried more intimacy than 1,000 spoken words. She looked down at our hands briefly, then back at me. No laughter in her eyes now, no casual neighborly banter, just a silent acknowledgement of the connection between us. And in that fragile moment, I understood exactly what she had meant when she said the nights were long. They weren't empty because of time, they were empty because they lacked this. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Thank you for not leaving." I swallowed hard, my thumb brushing lightly across her knuckle before I even realized what I was doing. I couldn't, even if I tried. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm. It belonged to us. At some point, she stood, her cardigan slipping slightly off one shoulder as she gathered the mugs and carried them to the sink. I watched the quiet ease in her movements, graceful yet unhurried, Like every step was measured against time, she no longer felt the need to chase. She glanced back at me with a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, but carried an unspoken invitation. "Let's move to the sofa," she said softly. "It feels less formal there." I nodded, following her into the living room. The space was warm and inviting, filled with soft touches that reflected her. Books stacked neatly on the coffee table, a candle flickering in the corner, a throw blanket draped across the armrest. The sofa itself was wide and deep, the kind that seemed built for comfort rather than appearances. She sat first, tucking one leg beneath her, and patted the cushion beside her. I lowered myself down, careful not to sit too close, though even with a small gap between us, I could feel the heat radiating from her body. The subtle fragrance of her perfume lingered in the air, mixed with the faint, waxy scent of the candle. She leaned back, exhaling as though the weight of the day was finally softening its hold. "I've lived here 10 years, she murmured, her gaze on the bookshelf across the room. "And this sofa has heard more of my secrets than anyone I know." I smiled faintly. Does that mean I'm in good company? Or does it mean I should be careful what I say? That earned a laugh, soft, genuine. The kind of laugh that lit her face more than the lamplight could. Maybe both. As she turned toward me, our knees brushed. Just the lightest touch, but it was enough to pull my attention away from anything else in the room. She didn't move away, and neither did I. The contact lingered, sending a quiet jolt up through me. Not overwhelming, but steady, like the faint spark before a fire. I told her a story about my childhood, something simple about climbing trees and scraping knees, about how I used to think the world was endless when I was a boy. She listened with an attentiveness that made me feel like my words mattered more than they actually did. Her head tilted slightly, her lips curving in amusement at the right places, her eyes warm and alive. At one point, she shifted closer, just a fraction, but enough that her shoulders nearly brushed. I could feel the warmth of her, the closeness wrapping around me like a quiet gravity. The space between us had shrunk, and with it, the unspoken tension grew. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice as I finished the story. But the truth was, I wasn't thinking about childhood anymore. I was thinking about the woman beside me, the way her presence filled every inch of the room, and the way my heart seemed to lean toward her before my body dared to. And in that moment, as her knee pressed lightly against mine and her eyes met mine with a softness that lingered just a little too long, I knew the sofa had found another secret to keep. The flicker of the candle on the table seemed to sync with the rhythm of the silence between us, soft, steady, and strangely fragile. We had been talking less and less, our words trailing into half-thoughts and unfinished sentences, until finally we were just sitting there listening to the quiet. She let out a long sigh, one that carried more than simple tiredness. It was the kind of sigh that came when someone had finally stopped holding in the weight of the day. Her shoulder brushed mine, light and unintentional at first, but she didn't move away. Instead, almost naturally, she leaned in, her head finding its place against my shoulder. The moment her cheek touched me, I froze, not because I wanted to pull back, but because I was afraid to move at all. Her hair brushed softly against my jawline, carrying that faint, elegant scent of jasmine I'd noticed earlier. I could feel the warmth of her breath through the thin fabric of my shirt, steady and slow, a rhythm that drew me in without effort. I let my arm shift slightly, hesitating before sliding around her. The movement was instinctive but careful, as though I was afraid to break whatever unspoken trust she had just handed me. My hand came to rest along her upper arm, fingers brushing against the knit of her cardigan. The fabric was warm, but her warmth beneath it was what I noticed most. She exhaled again, this time softer, and I felt the weight of her relax against me. Her body settled into mine, not heavy but certain, like she had been carrying something alone for too long and had finally decided she didn't need to anymore. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the candle's wick cracking every now and then. But inside me, everything was louder, the rush of my heartbeat, the tension in my chest, the quiet war between wanting more and reminding myself of the line I shouldn't cross. I closed my eyes briefly, letting myself feel the steadiness of her breathing against my side. It was grounding, intimate in a way that words could never replicate. Her trust was in the weight of her head on my shoulder, in the way her hand rested lightly against my chest as if it belonged there. I didn't want to move, didn't want to risk shattering the delicate balance we had found. I realized then that what I felt wasn't just attraction. It was a quiet pull toward her, toward the years she carried in her eyes, the softness in her laugh, the unspoken need she had allowed me to see. And though part of me longed for the courage to tilt my head and press a kiss to her hair, I didn't. Instead, I held her just as she was, letting her heartbeat steady against mine. It wasn't passion that filled the room. It was something rarer, a hesitant embrace that spoke louder than desire ever could. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Her head rested on my shoulder for what felt like an endless stretch of time, though I never once wished for it to end. The rhythm of her breathing had steadied, but mine hadn't. It was shallow, restless, fighting to keep its balance under the weight of everything unsaid. When she finally stirred, lifting her head from my shoulder, I thought she might pull away, create the space between us again. But she didn't. Instead, she turned toward me, her face so close I could see the fine lines around her eyes, softened by the glow of the lamp. Her gaze held mine, unwavering. "I didn't want to be alone tonight," she whispered. It was the same thing she had told me before, but this time, the words carried more. They weren't about silence anymore. They were about closeness, about needing to be seen, to be felt, to be held. Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, though her eyes didn't. And in that small fracture, I saw something so raw it stole the air from my lungs. I swallowed, my throat tight. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly. "I'm here." For a long second, we just sat there, our faces inches apart. I could feel her breath against my skin, warm and uneven, and I wondered if she could feel how hard my heart was beating. My hand, almost on its own, brushed against hers where it rested on the sofa cushion. She didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers shifted, curling gently to meet mine. The simplicity of it, the way her hand fit into mine, was almost unbearable. I wanted to close the gap between us, to let my lips find hers. But something in her eyes held me back, not out of rejection, but because what she wanted wasn't urgency. It was presence. She moved first, not with a kiss, but with something more vulnerable. Slowly, she leaned in until her forehead rested lightly against my chest. Then her arms slipped around me, steady and sure, pulling me into a full embrace. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate, as though she had finally chosen to trust the space we shared. My arms wrapped around her in return, holding her tightly, my chin resting lightly against her hair. I could feel her heartbeat against me, quick at first, then slowing, syncing with mine. The world outside the room faded. All that existed was the warmth of her body pressed against mine, the certainty of her arms, the quiet gravity pulling us together. I closed my eyes, breathing her in. The scent of her perfume lingered, soft and elegant, mixing with the faint trace of tea still on her skin. Every sense was filled with her, every thought pulled toward the undeniable truth. I didn't just want to be here tonight. I wanted to be wherever she was. She whispered against my chest, so softly I almost didn't hear it. "Don't let go." And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever, if she'd let me stay. At some point in the night, I drifted into sleep without meaning to. The last thing I remembered was the steady weight of her in my arms, her head tucked beneath my chin, and the way her breathing had finally evened out, soft and peaceful. When I opened my eyes again, morning light was spilling through the curtains, gentle and golden, painting the living room in a kind of quiet softness. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there on the sofa, my arms still wrapped around her, listening to the faint rhythm of her breaths. She stirred slightly, adjusting against me. Her hand, light and warm, rested over my chest, fingers curled as if they had settled there in sleep and never let go. I looked down at her, and for the first time, I saw her without the composure she always carried. She wasn't the confident, graceful neighbor who smiled politely in the hallway. She was simply a woman at rest, vulnerable, open, and impossibly beautiful. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. For a moment, she just blinked, her gaze finding mine, and then a small, sleepy smile curved her lips. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice low and rough from the night. I smiled back, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "Of course I am." She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she nestled closer for a moment, as though letting herself linger in the safety of my arms before the day pulled her back into reality. That small gesture, a simple press of her body into mine, was enough to make my chest ache with something I didn't dare name yet. Eventually, I eased us both upright. The room looked different in daylight. The candle on the table melted halfway down, the mugs from last night still sitting in the sink. Everything ordinary, yet everything changed. "I'll make coffee," I offered, standing before she could protest. She watched me move around her kitchen, and I could feel her eyes on me, not with the polite curiosity of a neighbor, but with the warmth of someone who had let me in past her guard. When I set the mug in front of her, she reached out, her hand brushing mine before wrapping around the cup. Her thumb lingered against my knuckles, a deliberate touch that said more than words. She looked up, her expression soft but certain. "I'm glad you stayed." Her words settled into me, grounding and steady. I sat beside her again, our shoulders brushing, and for the first time, silence didn't need filling. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. I realized then that last night hadn't been about a single evening. It was about something beginning, something fragile but real. She hadn't just made sure I stayed for the night. She had made sure I stayed in a way that mattered, in a way that went beyond the hours between dusk and dawn. And as the morning light wrapped around us, I knew I wasn't going anywhere.